Handel was the first superstar of classical music. With unwavering determination and superhuman creative power, he left his mark on an entire era. As a German composer who wrote Italian music for an English audience, he was revered by all three cultures and celebrated as their musical representative. But who Handel really was remains hidden behind the glossy surface. Who was George Frideric Handel, and what places and people influenced him? A biographical approach to the German artist of the century. George Frideric Handel was born in Halle, Germany in 1785. At the time, Halle was a small town of around 4,000 inhabitants, ravaged by the 30 Years' War and the plague. Handel's father was a practicing doctor. He started another family late in life and was already 62 years old when George Frideric was born. George showed an interest in music from an early age, but his father wanted his son to pursue a career in law and was against promoting George Frideric's obvious musical talent. As court physician, George was a regular visitor to the Duke. When the 8-year-old Handel played the organ in the presence of the Duke, the prince persuaded his father to have George Frideric trained as a musician. Handel now benefited from many years of excellent training with the composer and organist Friedrich Zacho, who remained his only teacher. Zacho was familiar with contemporary music and was able to show Handel the entire spectrum of European musical art. The years 1701 and 02 brought an important turning point. First, the respected Telemann stopped in Halle to hear the 16-year-old, and shortly afterwards, the 17-year-old met the composers Bononcini and Ariosti in Berlin, and the two sparked Handel's desire to write Italian opera. In addition to this musical encouragement, Handel had received an excellent humanistic education at grammar school, and he entered the recently founded university at the age of 16. Shortly afterwards, however, he accepted an offer to become a church organist at the age of 17, which was sensational even for the time. However, Handel did not see himself as a church musician in the medium term. The Pietist movement had taken hold in northern Germany, and in their view, music was only conceivable in the church. The only place where Handel could approach his goal in Germany was the opera house at Gänsemarkt in Hamburg. Handel now went to Hamburg, 300 kilometers away. Thanks to its fortifications, the city had been spared from the 30 Years' War, and with its 70,000 inhabitants had become a large city. The narrow streets and rough inhabitants of the Gange quarter must have made a threatening impression on the young George Frideric. But Hamburg also had a wealthy and cultivated bourgeoisie, which had an opera theatre built 20 years earlier at the Gänsemarkt, which had a considerable 2,000 seats. George Frideric now approached the opera house. To his disappointment, he was only offered a position as a violinist in the second violins. But at least he had a foot in the door. He became friends with Johann Mattheson, who was only 4 years his senior. This highly talented musician had already written his first opera works and often conducted performances from the harpsichord. During the following summer break, Handel accompanied his friend Mattheson to Lübeck to visit the famous organist Buxtehude in order to get to know the master and because they had heard that Buxtehude's position as organist was vacant. The two young musicians were now able to get to know the master with their own ears. However, the master was unable to persuade either of them to take up the post, as it was linked to his marriage to his daughter, who was already over 30 years old. Back in Hamburg, Handel now gained valuable experience in opera as an orchestral musician, and a year later he felt ready to compose his first Italian opera. His friend Mattheson supported him with advice and assistance and wrote maliciously in his memoirs 4 years later that he often had to admonish the inexperienced Handel to write Italian melodies instead of pedantic fugues. Thus, Handel's first opera, Almira, was performed in Hamburg and remained his only opera without castrati. Handel was pleased to note that the work was well received by the audience. One of the most beautiful pieces from Almira is the so-called Dance of the Asians, a sarabande which Handel later developed in his most famous aria, Lascia che pianga. Handel met Giangastone de' Medici in Hamburg, a son of the Florentine prince, who spent a few months in Hamburg due to his gambling and alcohol excesses in order to gain distance from his relatives. Gastone was homosexual and may have taken a liking to the young and handsome Handel. He was not to be Handel's last homosexual friend in the years to come, which still raises questions about Handel's own attitude today. However, Gastone invited Handel as a musician to visit him in Florence, which gave Handel the ticket he longed for to a princely court in Italy. In the meantime, it had become clear that he could only achieve mastery in the art of Italian opera in Italy. What Handel now encountered in Florence was the opposite of the Italy of his dreams. The Medici family was hopeless divided. Gastone's older brother Ferdinando was suffering from syphilis, and the city was in the stranglehold of Gastone's father, the unfortunate, bigoted Prince Cosimo Medici. As if that wasn't enough, all the family members suspected that Handel was another one of Gastone's boy lovers. That was a cold shower for Handel. The only ray of hope was that Ferdinando himself was a highly talented musician and a generous patron of music. Handel seized this opportunity and received a commission to compose his opera Rodrigo for good money, which was premiered in a small circle in Florence. Of Handel's 3 years in Italy, he spent most of his time in Rome. Shortly after his arrival in the Eternal City, he was given the opportunity to give an organ recital in the great church of San Giovanni in Laterano. The next day, the whole city was talking about the virtuoso Saxon. He met the rich aristocrat Ruspoli. Ruspoli invited him to live in his city palace for the next few months and play music for him and his guests. With this influential aristocrat, Handel was now able to establish contacts with many high ecclesiastical dignitaries, and the 22-year-old learned to move with great self-confidence in this social class. Many of the cardinals were very fond of art. They not only supported talented artists financially, but also became creative themselves. Cardinal Ottoboni, for example, wrote several libretti for oratorios by Scarlatti. Handel's stroke of luck was Cardinal Vincenzo Grimani, who wrote the libretto for the opera Agrippina for him. As it was forbidden to perform operas in Rome in those years, the premiere took place in Venice in 1709. It was a great success and is considered his first masterpiece in the Italian style. Venice became important for Handel for two reasons. Firstly, he became acquainted with the center of Italian opera, and secondly, he made the acquaintance of Baron von Kilmarnock, the equerry of the Hanoverian Prince George. Kilmarnock was enthusiastic about Agrippina and offered Handel a position in the Duchy of Hanover. Handel already knew at this point that his long-term destination would be London. He gladly accepted the invitation to Herrenhausen Palace in Hanover and then cleverly used it as a springboard to London. He arrived in Hanover in June 1710 and took up the post as Kapellmeister there. Handel quickly gained the trust of Prince Georg Ludwig and occasionally played music for the prince. However, he had little inclination to compose, as the principality had no opera. Handel had been contractually assured that he would be allowed to be absent from court for longer periods from time to time. He soon took advantage of this option. He travelled to London towards the end of the year. However, the prince did not let Handel go without ulterior motives. What exactly were George Ludwig's ulterior motives? To understand this, it is worth making a brief historical digression. The English royal family found itself in a delicate situation. The succession to the throne of the reigning Stuart dynasty was in jeopardy, and the distant Hanoverian line had a good chance of ascending to the English throne. How had this come about? Queen Anne had tried desperately to get an heir, but 17 pregnancies ended in stillbirth or the early death of the children. Her health was ruined, and another pregnancy was considered risky. After the Settlement Act of the Glorious Revolution, no regent of Catholic faith was allowed to ascend the throne. Anne was a Protestant Stuart, but all her close relatives were Catholic. This meant that Georg Ludwig's mother from the distant Hanover line was next in the dynastic line of succession. As Sophie was already 80 years old, George knew that he could soon have a claim to the English throne. And this is where Handel came into play. George's clever plan was to endow Handel with the title of Electoral Hanoverian Kapellmeister and place him as a cultural ambassador in London. This would enable him to position the distant Hanoverian court as a cosmopolitan institution, reduce resentment towards the Germans, and establish important contacts for George, as prominent musicians often had access to interesting contacts. Handel was thus able to kill two birds with one stone. On the one hand, he also received princely compensation in London, and on the other hand, the Hanoverian network of contacts in London opened the doors to interesting and financially powerful circles for him. However, there was one problem. Many Englishmen, and Queen Anne herself, were opposed to a Hanoverian king. They tried to bring a French alternative to the throne instead. When Handel arrived in London, however, it was not politics that dominated his thoughts, but he wanted to bring an Italian opera to London. At that time, the Queen's Theatre in the Haymarket had a monopoly on opera music. There he met Aaron Hill and Johann Heidecker. They had heard of Handel's Venetian success and were enthusiastic about the Germans' opera plans. Hill commissioned Handel to write the music for an opera as quickly as possible. And Hill himself sketched out the plot for a new opera, which gave him the opportunity as a clever playwright to incorporate many special effects into the plot. He planned to stage this opera with unprecedented expense in order to establish Italian opera in London with a bang. Handel began work in December. As he only had 6 weeks to compose the music, he did what was customary at the time. He took many musical themes from pieces from his earlier works. It is estimated that he recycled 40 numbers in this way. The result was fantastic. No other Handel opera was to have as many mega hits as Rinaldo. Rinaldo followed the conventions of classical opera seria. The distribution of roles conformed to stereotypes, the plot concerned high-ranking characters, and the music was based on the basso continuo and the canto fiorito, in which the virtuosos could show off their skills and improvisations in the da capo arias. The theatre's brilliant stage technology was spectacular and outrageous. Armida appears on a chariot hovering in the air, pulled by two fire-breathing dragons. Hill stunned the audience at the premiere with the next scene. He brought live sparrows onto the stage. Hundreds of these specimens flew into the stage sky and accompanied the singer with their song. Hill didn't skimp on the cast either. The entire theatre crew consisted of Italians, including the then leading castrati Niccolini as Rinaldo and Valentini as Stazio. The spectacle did not fail to have an effect, and Rinaldo became the talk of the town, and the melodies became popular hits. The 26-year-old Handel was happy. After Rinaldo, Handel had to return to Hanover. He reported back to George, who seemed satisfied with his ambassador. During these 6 months, Handel did not have to do much work, and he agreed with the elector to resume his activities in London. Handel had used this time to visit his family in Halle. He was pleased to be appointed godfather to a child by his sister, but saddened that his second sister had died in the meantime. As in Rome, Handel began to make use of his contacts in high circles in London. The most important contact was the Earl of Burlington, himself 10 years younger than Handel. He had inherited an immense fortune from his father. The precocious young man was very fond of the arts and, at the age of 18, regularly gathered illustrious personalities around him in his house, all of whom came from the same literary circles. Handel lived in Burlington's palace for 3 years and got to know writers such as Alexander Pope, John Gay, and Jonathan Swift, who later became world famous with Gulliver's Travels. The male friends spent a lot of time together, and the Palais Burlington became an Arcadia populated by art-loving men. The extent to these male friendships is the subject of speculation, but without solid evidence. Due to the unresolved succession to the throne, the great tensions between Catholics and Protestants, and the long-lasting war of the Spanish succession, it was clear to the highly intelligent Handel that the political situation was highly explosive, and that his mission could quickly lead him into dangerous waters. Handel's political and diplomatic skills were certainly excellent, just as he was able to shine in the highest circles in the Florentine and Roman shark tank of cardinals. But he had to be on his guard because London, with 3 times the population of Rome, was in a different league. Handel was also self-confident enough not to put his personal well-being behind him. He was able to count on an interesting contact. Among the small circle of Arcadians in Burlington's house was the physician Arbuthnot. He was not only a lover of literature, but also the Queen's personal physician. This gave Handel an exclusive and explosive source for a state secret, for he knew about the Queen's health, which was kept top secret. Handel learned that the Queen's health was at rock bottom after 17 pregnancies and that she was no longer in a position to finally give birth to an heir to the throne. This information was crucial for Hanover. Handel presumably passed this secret information on to Hanover and was thus able to score more points with the elector. In the meantime, the English Queen had concluded a peace treaty with the other side in the endless war with France. England's allies, including Hanover, were not at all pleased and condemned this act by England. Through his contacts with the Queen, Handel was given the lucrative opportunity to write a piece of music for the celebrations of peace. Handel now allowed himself an unprecedented boldness towards George and wrote a Te Deum for this occasion, which was so hated by Hanover. This affront resulted in his dismissal by George. But with this piece written in English, he won the hearts of the English. When the Te Deum was performed in June 1713, Anne was already seriously ill and died in August. This made George King of England and Elector of Hanover at the same time. This turn of events came at a dangerous time for Handel. Would the king react with hostility? But Handel was lucky. George could not or would not take revenge, because he still needed Handel, for the turmoil and mistrust in England towards the foreign German ruler was great. George now planned to distinguish himself with a truly royal action. He invited the highest nobility on a royal pleasure cruise on a ship and the common people to the banks of the river Thames. The attraction was that their ships would be accompanied by another ship with an orchestra on board playing festive music. George and his guests were enraptured by Handel's water music, and his resentment towards the rebellious bandmaster was forgotten. Shortly afterwards, George was able to secure his domestic political power by defeating a Scottish army of rebels. Handel returned to Burlington in Arcadia once more. However, many of his Arcadian friends were on the losing side politically. Pope had lost his fortune, Swift had to return to Ireland, and Gay and Arbuthnot lost their offices, and after some time the circle disbanded. King George now needed a place where he could present himself to the public in a manner befitting his rank, and he chose the opera. As he did not want to bear the costs alone, he initiated a subscription system where wealthy nobles and citizens could buy shares and even earn a return if business went well. Handel was appointed artistic director and Heidecker commercial director for the implementation and operational management. At the age of 34, Handel was where he wanted to be, managing one of the leading opera houses in Europe and able to compose for the best artists. To this end, Handel traveled to the continent in 1719 to hire the best singers. However, the supervisory committee did not want to be at Handel's mercy as a composer, and they decided that the Italian composers Bononcini and Ariosti should also regularly write pieces alongside Handel. Bononcini now became Handel's rival. The dispute even became political, with the opposition Tories supporting Bononcini and the ruling Whigs supporting Handel. Handel was able to win this power struggle in 1722, but this meant that the burden remained on his shoulders. The public now expected regular sensations, hits, stars, and scandals. Handel was to deliver all of this, and the following years were to be his galley years. Handel needed star singers to fill the theatre again and again. In the early years, these were the castrati, and the opera house had to spend huge sums to acquire the sought-after singers. Of all the castrati, Handel held Senesino in his highest esteem. He already knew him from Italy and entrusted him with most of his premieres. It was not uncommon for Handel to adapt arias for the singers, and so we can still sense the brilliance of these voices in the music. Handel subsequently also engaged female stars. Francesca Cuzzoni was his choice in the early years. The singer could demonstrate her art in the so-called da capo aria, where the singers were allowed to ornament the aria as they wished and showed off their virtuosity in the da capo part. That means in the repetition section. The engagement of the expensive singers weighed heavily on the budget. Thanks to the success of Giulio Cesare, the opera company was able to pay out a dividend for the only time that year. But a few years later, the company suffered two blows that brought it to its knees. The first blow was the death of King George, the founder of the theatre, which forced an immediate halt to theatre operations. The second blow was that John Gay, Handel's friend from the Arcadia days, wrote a hit for a rival theatre with the Beggar's Opera. And worst of all, it made fun of the bombastic opera seria. What's more, it was performed in English and not in the unloved and incomprehensible Italian language. The play struck a chord with the times and was performed in an incredible 62 times in succession. It thus attracted the attention of the audience and dealt Handel's company the death blow. His opera Siroe was performed to a practically empty house. One ray of hope was that the heir of the throne, George II, commissioned Handel to compose the music for his coronation. The Royal Opera was now dead, but Handel was determined to start a new opera company together with Heidecker. In the end, they were even given the entire infrastructure, such as instruments, costumes, stage machinery, etc., as a gift. And not only that, the owners financed the two of them with start-up capital, which they could use to start a new opera company on their own account. Now Handel was no longer just an employee, but became an impresario. Handel went back to Italy to find Italian singers for the new opera. But the A-League no longer wanted to come. Handel returned humiliated. Without stars, the first season was a disaster. Handel now had to suck up to Senesino. Senesino cold-bloodedly demanded an outrageous sum, and Handel had to contritely agree. He now began to compose new works frenetically and desperately, but even with Senesino, the theatres remained half empty. Under pressure from friends, Handel began to adapt his program. He now began to compose oratorios and, to his surprise, was successful. But then Handel made a mistake. He excluded subscribers to the premiere of the oratorio Deborah and reaped a huge shitstorm. This experience led to a health breakdown and symptoms of paralysis in his right hand. The situation was serious. Handel, who was heavily overweight, went to Aachen in Germany for a cure. With an iron will, he underwent a horse cure there, imposing a threefold dose of the cure activities on himself. And after 6 weeks, Handel's physical and mental condition improved drastically. Out of joy and gratitude, Handel, who had recently been paralyzed, surprised the churchgoers of St. John's Abbey Church with an improvised concert. From then on, the nuns of the church spoke a miraculous healing by God. Reinvigorated, Handel returned to London and surprised his audience with the oratorio Soul. Soul was a great success, but he had to present the next oratorio to a half-empty hall. As he was not sure whether the next project, the oratorio Messiah, would please his Londoners, he decided to perform it in Dublin during the Easter weeks. Handel assumed that, as a sacred work, the oratorio would not fall under the general theatre ban during the Easter holidays. He wanted to perform Messiah in the music halls on Fishamble Street, but he needed the singers from Dublin Cathedral. Their dean was Handel's old acquaintance Jonathan Swift. However, he only released his singers when Handel agreed to give the first performance of Messiah as a charity event. Messiah became a great success and was performed 6 times to sell out audiences. Handel was able to gain a regular audience in London with his oratorios. The oratorios had an important advantage over the operas. He was able to produce them much more cheaply, and so Handel was able to earn good money with each work until the end of his life. England experienced a turbulent decade in the 1740s. It was characterized by civil war and the war with Spain. Handel now began to support the English troops with musical means, and so he won the hearts of the English once again. He acquired English citizenship and experienced a late career highlight in 1749. He was allowed to perform his fireworks music in front of 12,000 spectators to celebrate the end of the war in 1749. The wealthy Handel was now at peace, and he began to do charitable work. The greatest sign of this was his commitment to large orphanage. In 51, the 65-year-old began to lose some of his sight. Various operations by the quack and the oculist Taylor were also unsuccessful. He went completely blind, and things became quieter around Handel. He occasionally composed and improvised at concerts on the organ. On the morning of April 14th, 1759, Handel died in his apartment in Brook Street at the age of 74. He was buried with great honors in Westminster Abbey.